My parents skipped my birthday for my brother's award, so I moved out. I was sitting in my empty apartment at 11:30 that night, staring at the single cupcake I'd bought myself from the corner store. 22 years old and celebrating alone, because my parents decided my brother's academic recognition ceremony was more important than my birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been planning this day for weeks, hoping they'd finally prioritize me for once in my life. The whole mess started 3 months earlier when I reminded them about my birthday plans. I'd specifically asked them to keep the date free because I wanted to have a proper family dinner for the first time in years. My mom nodded enthusiastically and promised they'd make it special. My dad even suggested we go to that expensive steakhouse downtown that I'd been wanting to try since I was a teenager. Everything seemed perfect until 2 weeks before my birthday when my brother casually mentioned during our weekly family video call that his university was hosting an awards ceremony the same evening. He'd been nominated for some academic excellence recognition, and naturally, my parents immediately started making plans to attend. When I reminded them about my birthday dinner, my mother's face went blank for a moment before she suggested we could celebrate the next day instead. The disappointment hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to be understanding. I suggested we could do lunch instead, or maybe celebrate earlier in the week. But my brother kept finding reasons why those alternatives wouldn't work, and my parents kept siding with him. It became clear that once again, his achievements were taking precedence over my existence. I spent the next week going back and forth with them, trying to find a compromise. My dad kept saying things like how proud they were of my brother's accomplishments and how birthdays happen every year, but awards ceremonies are special occasions. My mom tried to soften the blow by promising to make it up to me, but her words felt hollow and rehearsed. The breaking point came when I realized they hadn't even bothered to cancel our restaurant reservation. I called the steakhouse to confirm, and they told me the booking was still active. My parents had simply assumed I'd understand and quietly disappear from their plans, without any real conversation about it. That night, I lay in bed thinking about all the times this had happened before. Every school play where they'd missed my performance, but attended my brother's soccer games. Every graduation where they'd arrived late because they were helping him with some project. Every milestone in my life that had been overshadowed by his needs and achievements. I realized I was tired of being the accommodating son who always stepped aside for his golden child brother. The pattern had been going on for so long that I'd normalized it, convincing myself that being understanding was somehow noble. But lying there in the dark, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was transforming into something else entirely. My best friend challenged me to finally stand up for myself. The next morning, I called my best friend and told him everything. He'd been watching this dynamic play out for years, and he was angrier than I was. He reminded me of all the times I'd made excuses for my parents' behavior, all the times I'd convinced myself that family harmony was more important than my own feelings. He challenged me to think about what I really wanted from this situation. Not what would keep everyone happy, not what would avoid conflict, but what I actually needed for myself. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, I had a plan that scared and excited me in equal measure. I decided to give them one final chance to choose me. I called my parents and explained calmly how important this birthday was to me, how I'd been looking forward to it for months, and how disappointed I was that they were choosing to attend my brother's ceremony instead. I told them I understood they were proud of him, but I needed them to understand that I was hurting. My mother's response was everything I expected and nothing I wanted to hear. She launched into a lengthy explanation about how my brother's ceremony was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, how I should be proud of him too, and how we could celebrate my birthday any other time. She made it sound like I was being selfish for wanting my parents to attend my birthday dinner. My father was even worse. He accused me of being jealous of my brother's success and suggested that maybe I needed to focus on achieving something worth celebrating instead of demanding attention for simply existing another year. His words cut deeper than I expected, and I realized that this wasn't just about one missed birthday. The conversation ended with them hanging up on me when I pressed them to reconsider. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, and something inside me finally snapped. I was done being the understanding son who always compromised his own needs for the sake of family peace. That evening, I started looking at apartment listings online. I'd been living at home to save money, but suddenly having my own space felt more important than financial security. I found a small one-bedroom place across town that was available immediately. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that felt revolutionary. I didn't tell anyone about my decision right away. Instead, I spent the next few days quietly organizing my belongings and figuring out the logistics of moving out. I opened a separate bank account, transferred my savings, and started mentally preparing for the conversation I'd have to have with my parents. The night before my birthday, I packed everything I owned into boxes and loaded them into my car. I left a note on my pillow explaining that I was moving out and wouldn't be available for their makeup celebration. I turned off my phone and drove to my new apartment, where I spent the night assembling furniture and trying to process what I'd just done. My brother called me crying, begging me to come home. 3 days after I moved out, my brother called me sobbing. He'd won his award, but the celebration felt hollow because our parents had spent the entire evening worrying about where I was and why I wasn't answering their calls. He said he felt guilty for accepting the recognition knowing it had cost me my birthday dinner. His call caught me completely off guard. I'd expected anger, maybe accusations of being dramatic, but not genuine remorse. He told me he'd tried to convince our parents to attend my birthday dinner instead of his ceremony, but they'd insisted that academic achievements were more important than birthdays. He revealed something that shocked me even more. Apparently, our parents had been planning to surprise me with a big celebration the following weekend, complete with extended family and a custom cake. They'd been so focused on keeping it secret that they dismissed my actual birthday as unimportant, assuming I'd understand once I saw their surprise. The revelation made me angrier, not less. They'd made a unilateral decision about how I should celebrate my birthday without consulting me, then dismissed my actual wishes as inconvenient. The fact that they'd planned something elaborate for later didn't excuse their absence on the day that mattered to me. My brother begged me to come home, promising that things would be different. He said he'd talked to our parents about their favoritism and how it had affected me over the years. He claimed they finally understood how their actions had hurt me and wanted to make amends. I listened to his apologies and promises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another temporary fix. How many times had we had conversations about fairness and equal treatment that resulted in no real change? How many times had I been told that things would be different, only to find myself in the same situation months later? I told him I appreciated his call and his apologies, but I needed time to think about what I wanted from our relationship moving forward. I wasn't ready to come home just because they'd finally realized their behavior had consequences. The conversation ended with both of us crying, and I spent the rest of the night wondering if I'd made the right decision. Moving out had felt empowering in the moment, but now I was questioning whether I'd overreacted to a situation that could have been resolved with better communication. My uncle revealed a family secret that changed everything. 2 weeks later, my uncle showed up at my apartment unannounced. He'd gotten my address from my brother and said he needed to talk to me about something important. I barely knew him well since he'd had some kind of falling out with my parents years ago, but his serious expression made me invite him in. He sat down at my kitchen table and told me a story I'd never heard before. Apparently, my brother wasn't just the favorite child because of his achievements. He'd been born after my parents had struggled with infertility for years, and they'd almost given up on having a second child. When my brother finally arrived, they'd treated him like a miracle baby. My uncle explained that my parents had never learned to balance their gratitude for my brother's existence with their responsibilities to me. They'd gotten so caught up in celebrating every milestone of his life that they'd forgotten I needed attention and validation too. The favoritism wasn't malicious, but it was deeply ingrained and had shaped our family dynamic for decades. He also revealed that he'd tried to intervene several times over the years, pointing out their unequal treatment of their sons. But my parents had always dismissed his concerns, insisting that they loved us both equally and that he was imagining problems where none existed. Eventually, he'd stopped trying to help and had distanced himself from the family. The conversation shifted when he told me about his own experience being the overlooked sibling. He'd had a similar relationship with my grandfather, who'd favored my father in much the same way. My uncle had eventually cut contact with the family entirely, and he'd spent years regretting that decision. He urged me not to make the same mistake he had, but also validated my feelings about the situation. He said I had every right to set boundaries and demand better treatment, but cutting off contact entirely would likely hurt me more than it would hurt them. His visit left me more confused than ever. I'd been operating under the assumption that my parents' favoritism was a conscious choice, but learning about the underlying reasons made me question whether they could actually change their behavior. I spent the next few days researching family dynamics and birth order psychology, trying to understand how patterns like this develop and whether they can be broken. The more I learned, the more I realized that my situation wasn't unique, but that didn't make it any less painful. My parents finally admitted they'd been wrong. A month after moving out, my parents showed up at my apartment with flowers, takeout from my favorite restaurant, and tear-stained faces. They'd been calling and texting constantly, but I'd been screening their communications because I wasn't ready to deal with their explanations and apologies. My mother looked like she'd been crying for days. She immediately started apologizing, admitting that they'd prioritized my brother's needs over mine for years without realizing the impact it was having on me. She said they'd been so focused on celebrating his achievements that they'd forgotten to celebrate me as a person. My father was more reserved, but his apology felt more genuine. He admitted that he'd been defensive in our last conversation because he knew I was right and he couldn't handle the guilt. He said he'd been replaying moments from my childhood, realizing how many times they'd made me feel invisible in favor of my brother. They'd brought photo albums filled with pictures of my accomplishments and milestones that I'd forgotten about. My mother had apparently been keeping track of everything, but she'd never made as big a deal about my achievements as she had about my brother's. Seeing those forgotten moments made me realize that they did care about me, even if they'd been terrible at showing it. The conversation lasted hours, and for the first time in my life, I felt like they were actually listening to me. They didn't make excuses for their behavior or try to minimize my feelings. They acknowledged that their actions had hurt me, and admitted that they needed to change how they treated both of their sons. My mother asked me what I needed from them moving forward. I told her I wanted them to start treating my milestones and important moments with the same enthusiasm they showed for my brother's achievements. I wanted them to stop assuming I'd be understanding and accommodating when conflicts arose. Most importantly, I wanted them to start seeing me as an individual with my own needs and feelings. My father promised they'd work on being more conscious of their behavior and more intentional about giving me equal attention and support. He said they'd already started having conversations with my brother about sharing space and not monopolizing family events. They asked me to consider moving back home, but I told them I needed to keep my own space for now. Living independently had given me a sense of control and self-worth that I'd never experienced before. I wasn't ready to give that up, even if our relationship was improving. The surprise that made me realize how much had really changed. 6 months later, my parents threw me a surprise party for my promotion at work. They'd coordinated with my friends, decorated my apartment, and even convinced my brother to fly in from his university. The gesture felt genuine and thoughtful in a way that their previous attempts at celebration had not. But the real surprise came when my brother pulled me aside during the party. He told me he'd been seeing a counselor to work through his guilt about the favoritism in our family. He'd realized that being the favorite child had been just as damaging for him as being overlooked had been for me. He explained that he'd never learned to handle failure or disappointment because our parents had always cushioned his setbacks. He'd developed anxiety about maintaining his perfect image because he felt like our parents' love was conditional on his continued success. In trying to protect him from disappointment, they'd actually made him more fragile. The conversation made me realize that our parents' favoritism hadn't just hurt me. It had created unrealistic expectations for my brother that he was struggling to live up to. We'd both been damaged by their inability to treat us as individuals with different needs and strengths. My brother apologized again for all the times he'd accepted preferential treatment without speaking up. He said he'd been too young to understand the dynamic when it started, and by the time he was old enough to see it clearly, it felt too established to change. We talked about rebuilding our relationship as adults, separate from our parents' influence. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my brother as an equal rather than as the overlooked sibling of the family star. The party ended with my parents giving a speech about how proud they were of both of their sons. They acknowledged that they'd made mistakes in the past, but committed to doing better moving forward. The words felt genuine, but I knew that real change would take time and consistent effort. I looked around at my friends and family celebrating my achievement, and I realized that moving out had been the right decision. It had forced everyone to confront the dysfunction in our family, and had given me the space I needed to develop my own identity separate from my role as the accommodating son. My brother's girlfriend exposed the truth about our family. A year after moving out, my brother's girlfriend contacted me privately through social media. She'd been dating him for 6 months and had some concerns about our family dynamic that she wanted to discuss with me. I was hesitant at first, but her message seemed genuine and worried rather than gossipy. We met for coffee, and she told me things about my family that I'd never noticed from the inside. She'd observed my parents' behavior during family gatherings and had been shocked by how differently they treated my brother and me. She said it was obvious to anyone from the outside that there was a clear favorite. But her real concern was about my brother's reaction to their changing behavior. Apparently, he'd been struggling with the fact that our parents were now making an effort to give me equal attention. He'd started acting out when he wasn't the center of attention, and she was worried about his emotional maturity. She told me that my brother had been calling our parents multiple times a day, seeking constant validation and reassurance. When they didn't immediately respond to his messages or calls, he'd become anxious and upset. She realized that he'd never learned to function without their constant attention and approval. The conversation revealed that my decision to move out had created a ripple effect throughout the family. My parents were trying to change their behavior, but my brother was struggling to adapt to sharing their attention. The girlfriend was concerned that he was becoming increasingly dependent on external validation. She also shared that my brother had been talking about moving back home after graduation, despite having job offers in other cities. He seemed afraid to be independent and was looking for reasons to stay close to our parents. She worried that he was sacrificing his own growth to maintain the familiar dynamic. Her insights made me realize that my family's healing process was more complicated than I'd initially thought. It wasn't just about my parents learning to treat me better. It was about all of us learning to function as healthy individuals within a family system that had been dysfunctional for decades. I thanked her for her honesty and asked her to keep me updated on how things developed. I also suggested that my brother might benefit from professional help to work through his anxiety about independence and his need for constant validation. The conversation left me feeling grateful for my decision to move out and establish my own life. I'd been forced to develop independence and self-reliance, while my brother had been enabled to remain emotionally dependent on our parents. My parents asked me to move back home for a shocking reason. 2 years after moving out, my parents asked me to meet them for dinner at the same steakhouse where we'd planned to celebrate my birthday. They said they had something important to discuss with me, and their serious expressions made me nervous about what they might reveal. The conversation started with them updating me on my brother's situation. He'd graduated from university, but had moved back home instead of accepting a job offer in another city. He'd been struggling with anxiety and depression, and they were concerned about his ability to function independently. They explained that they'd finally realized the damage their favoritism had caused to both of their sons. While they'd been trying to support my brother through his difficulties, they'd come to understand that their overprotectiveness had prevented him from developing essential life skills. Then they made a request that completely shocked me. They asked me to consider moving back home temporarily to help my brother transition to independence. They thought that having a successful, independent sibling around might motivate him to work on his own growth. I was stunned by the request. After years of being overlooked and dismissed, they were now asking me to come home and help the brother who'd been favored over me. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I struggled to process the emotions their request brought up. They assured me that this wasn't about returning to the old dynamic. They said they'd learned from their mistakes and wanted to create a healthier family environment where both sons could thrive. They also offered to help me save money by living at home, while I pursued some personal goals I'd been putting off. The offer was tempting from a financial perspective, but I was concerned about falling back into old patterns. I'd worked hard to establish my independence and sense of self-worth, and I wasn't sure I was ready to risk losing that progress. They gave me time to think about their request and promised that if I decided to move back, it would be on my terms. They said they'd respect my boundaries and wouldn't expect me to sacrifice my own needs for my brother's benefit. I spent weeks considering their offer, discussing it with friends and thinking about what would be best for everyone involved. The decision would determine not just my living situation, but the future of my relationship with my family. My final decision changed our family forever. After careful consideration, I decided to move back home, but with strict conditions. I would contribute to household expenses, maintain my own social life and independence, and would not be responsible for managing my brother's emotional needs. I made it clear that I was coming home as an adult family member not as a caretaker or mediator. The transition was awkward at first. My brother seemed embarrassed by his dependence on our parents and resentful of my independence. But gradually, he started asking me questions about living on my own, managing finances, and dealing with work stress. Our relationship began to shift from competitive to collaborative. I watched my parents consciously work to treat us equally, and while they still made mistakes, their efforts were genuine and noticeable. They started celebrating my achievements with the same enthusiasm they'd always shown for my brothers, and they began asking for my input on family decisions. My brother slowly started taking steps toward independence. He got a part-time job, started contributing to household expenses, and began making plans to move out within the year. Having a role model who'd successfully navigated independence seemed to give him the confidence he needed. The experience taught me that sometimes the most difficult family situations can be resolved when everyone is willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward change. My decision to move out had been necessary to break the dysfunctional pattern, but my decision to move back home had been equally important for healing. Our family will never be perfect, but we've learned to communicate more honestly and treat each other with more respect. My parents have become more conscious of their behavior, my brother has started developing independence, and I've learned to advocate for myself while still maintaining family relationships. The whole experience showed me that sometimes you have to be willing to lose something important to you in order to save it. Moving out had been scary and painful, but it had ultimately forced all of us to confront our problems and work toward solutions. Looking back, I realized that my 22nd birthday was a turning point that changed the trajectory of my entire family. What started as a missed dinner became a catalyst for growth and healing that none of us could have anticipated. Today, my relationship with my parents is stronger than it's ever been, and my brother and I have developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than competition. Sometimes the most difficult decisions lead to the most meaningful outcomes, and I'm grateful I had the courage to stand up for myself when it mattered most.